Listen, this domination and submission standard that I keep telling y'all about does not just surface in heterosexual relationships between men and women. They can show up in family dynamics as well. And I recognize definitely some signs of it, unfortunately, in this incident with Rob Reiner's family and his son. Now, you've had a lot of people on the internet speculating as to what would lead to such a drastic and horrific occurrence. And a lot of people have guessed that it was because of the drug addiction. Maybe it was because of some mental illness. Of course, now, I think the son is trying to claim, some mental illness. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia or something like that. Some people have even gone so far as to assume that there may have been some spiritual influence. And I have quite honestly thought that myself. We don't ultimately know. One thing I do know, though, is that there are plenty of people walking around who are struggling with drug habits who do not act out in this way. There are plenty of people walking around with mental illness, walking around who do not act out in this way. As a matter of fact, the statistics apparently show that people who suffer from schizophrenia and different types of mental illness often are more likely to suffer violence inflicted upon them or harassment inflicted upon them by other people rather than them causing harm to others. So why do I connect what happened in that situation to some possible manifestations of the domination and submission standard? Well, in my new book, Fuck Submission, Ending the Gender Wars for Good, I explain how the domination and submission standard, particularly in the way that it manifests here in the Western world, in the US, is a function of 4 particular elements. I like to call it a table with 4 legs. The first leg is white supremacy. The second leg is male supremacy. The third leg is economic supremacy, or capitalism run amok, unchecked capitalism. The fourth leg is psychological supremacy, often exerted through male-centered religions. Now, a lot of people are out there talking about narcissism and narcissistic abuse, sociopathy or psychopathy, and how those things can show up in family dynamics. And, maybe some people are tired of hearing that phrase, but, since we put a name to this condition, it is good that a lot of people have a better understanding now of what this particular, type of behavior is. We've been able to put a name to it and help people develop strategies for recognizing and combating it. Well, what if there was something going on in that family behind closed doors that nobody knows about? Because behavior is learned. That's one thing that my mama used to always tell me. Behavior is learned. And if the Reiners' son was a young man who was, maybe some spoiled Hollywood kid that got whatever he wanted, but in the midst of these struggles, maybe the parents cut him off, or for whatever reason they started to, they reached a limit in enabling his behavior or whatever, and he snapped. That is one assumption that I've heard people make. What if that was the situation? What if he was groomed in some way behind the scenes? Maybe he suffered some abuse. We're hearing in the last few years, we've heard so many stories about all of these children and young people who were raised in that Hollywood environment, who were taken advantage of, whose parents literally sold them, bartered them into some form of, sexual abuse or prostitution. What if he suffered some form of that and the parents really didn't do anything about it? What if he was abused behind the scenes and the parents really did a wonderful job of putting forth this wonderful benevolent image to the public, and, he was really being harmed behind the scenes? I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying it's a possibility and no one really knows. Maybe some investigation will ultimately reveal it. Maybe we'll never know. But I do know that people don't just haul off and delete people, particularly their parents, out of the blue, out of nothing. And yeah, people said that there were signs that he was, not in his right mind. But the reason why I'm tying this back again to this domination and submission standard is because, we see what's going on around this world. We see who the mass pew-pewers typically are. These are people who have been groomed to believe that they are supposed to be the dominators in the world. These are the people who have gotten the messaging from the time that they were old enough to process information that they are supposed to be on top. And it's the same kind of thing that happens in a relationship when an abuser decides that, or when a person who's being abused decides that they're not going to enable the abuse anymore, they're not going to put up with it anymore, and the abuser snaps and says, well, if you're not going to let me get my way, I'm just going to go off in this mode. It's the same kind of situation. It's a situation where a narcissistic individual or a sociopathic individual or psychopathic individual decides that they have a right to exert control, to dominate another person. And if the person won't allow it, well, then they just won't get to live anymore. It's a problem that runs deep. It is so deeply entrenched in the way that we see things, the way that we conduct ourselves in relationships with other people. And it's high time that more of us start to recognize where this comes from and why it's so deeply embedded in our culture.